Hello there, welcome to the Bardo podcast. What if the way that we think about time is actually stopping us from being free? In today's episode, I'm speaking with Emily Herring about the lives and ideas of Henri Bergson, a philosopher who believed that our thinking was too rigid, too mechanical, and that real freedom comes from something much harder to describe. My name is Marc Salmon, I'm a comedian and a practicing Buddhist who needs a lot of practice. Also spent much of my working life in adult social care. This is a podcast about philosophy, comedy, spirituality, and trying to think a bit more clearly in confusing and ridiculous times. Emily is a writer based in Paris. She studies philosophy at the Sorbonne and has a PhD in the history and philosophy of science from Leeds University. She's also the author of Herald of a Restless World, the first English language biography of Henri Bergson. We talk about time, memory, intuition, why laughter might be a kind of social correction, and what it might mean to actually become a bit more free. I really enjoyed this one. It's always good to stretch your brain a little bit. So let's sit back, relax, float downstream as we enter the Bardo.
Maybe we could start by asking, did you invite me because I'm called Herring and you're called Salmon and it's like a fish moment? Was that the main?
Yeah, I if I could exclusively book fish-based guests, I would be happy with that. Did you? How has it been being called Herring? Did you get? Because I got quite a lot of abuse when I was younger.
Well, I grew up in France, so people thought I was German. They thought it was a German name and they didn't get it. So I actually escaped the bullying on that side. Yeah, I quite like it. I think it's
Yeah.
like a cool, like, I'm Dr. Herring, and I think that's like a really good supervillain
Yeah.
name.
Yeah. So I've been reading your book. I've been reading it over the last few weeks. Here we go. I've got it here as well. So it's lovely. Also lovely. I'm loving the pink on this. It's a really nice
Yeah.
design. And I thought we could jump straight in with because I knew about Bergson, but I wasn't quite aware of how famous he was. And you sort of stress throughout the book how he was a celebrity philosopher, basically.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we could maybe give a brief introduction to who Henri Bergson was and that kind of cultural moment that maybe made it possible for him to become the most famous philosopher in the world.
Yeah, so he was born in 1859, which is the same year as Darwin published the Origin, which is relevant. We might talk about that a bit later. And he kind of came up the kind of classic French academia route. But he around 1900 he started lecturing in a quite odd institution that I don't know if there's an equivalent outside of France. It's called the Collège de France. It's been around for centuries, and basically the idea is that it's all public lectures. So it's all these famous intellectuals, or not necessarily famous, but sort of prestigious intellectuals giving public lectures in all sorts of topics, and that certainly helped. It doesn't fully explain why he was so famous, but it helped. Because that was an opportunity for him to present his philosophy of time, memory, freedom, and apparently he was an extremely gifted speaker. And in time, he started attracting way more people than the lecture theatre could contain. And I've obviously had to think really hard about why that would have been. And also, he was attracting lots of women to his lectures, which was also very unusual. And there's certainly a sense in which he was speaking to a moment, a cultural moment. He was speaking to certain anxieties that people in the late 19th, early 20th century had around the mechanization of life, around different ways in which quantification and science were seeping into areas where they hadn't previously been invited, such as, human consciousness, with, psychology becoming a science and becoming something very quantitative. But also, theories of evolution, and also just the general mechanization of life through, industrialization, and the ways in which, time and space had just been totally transformed through travel and various ways of measuring time. And I think his way of looking at all these subjects really helped alleviate some of those anxieties for people, because he was giving a different perspective, and he was challenging quite a lot of those things.
And there was loads of different people as well at the lectures. It was a real mix. So you mentioned that there was many women came, and we'll maybe touch on this later. There was a lot of sort of misogynistic criticism. Was that unusual for a philosopher to become like a huge cultural phenomenon at the time? Was that a normal thing?
I get the sense that with Bergson, it was, beyond anything that anyone had seen, at least in a while. Even though in France, throughout the 20th century, that certainly happened after Bergson quite a bit with people like Sartre and Foucault, so it's not completely unusual. But Bergson was maybe, I would say, the first to that level. And what was interesting was he, as you said, he attracted to his lectures, there were all these, people who weren't necessarily philosophers, but who were getting a lot out of his philosophy. And I think that says more about his philosophy maybe than about the celebrity of philosophers itself, if that makes sense.
And they were open to all. And
Yeah.
so perhaps, again, one of the criticisms that was levelled was that maybe it was from an elitist position of, who are these regular schmoes coming along to this guy's lectures?
Absolutely. So there would be lots of philosophy students who would go to his lectures. They would basically cross the street from the Sorbonne, which is in the same area.
Yeah.
And they would arrive and they would find that there were no seats left, because it was full of, women. It was full of artists, and just, as you said, regular people who had read about him in the newspaper and were coming to see what the fuss was all about, but also, people writing pamphlets on revolutionary syndicalism were there as well.
Yeah.
Which I should say now, that wasn't Bergson was by no means a kind of radical political thinker at all. If anything, he was what we today would call a centrist, probably. And yet all these thinkers were able to, because he was speaking and writing about subjects such as freedom in a radical way, freedom understood as absolute, and creativity, all those thinkers were able to find things in his thinking.
Yeah. And you write a nice piece at the start of the book as well about this. I can't remember his name. It's a poor economist, and people are like yawning. So could you explain that?
Yeah. So because around especially around sort of 1905, 1910, Bergson's lectures had become so popular that if you arrived at the start of the lecture, the lecture theatre was already full, because people were sending, so rich women were sending their valets to reserve a seat. And then people were also just arriving hours in advance, which meant that the guy lecturing before Bergson suddenly had a full house, and he didn't know what was going on, but they weren't there to listen to him. And this poor economist who was lecturing about quite boring subjects about sort of, economic history of the French, all these things, political philosophy, but not things that were very riveting. He just had these valets playing cards at the back of the room, and you had people sort of heckling him, which was obviously really embarrassing for Bergson, actually, because that was not, he did not expect any of that, and that was not something that he sought out, really, and he was very surprised by it and kind of horrified. There's an anecdote where one day Bergson arrived in his lecture theatre, and his admirers had covered his desk in flowers, and he was just kind of horrified by this, embarrassed, and said, "I'm not a ballerina." It was he was quite a shy person, in the way that great performers are actually often quite reserved and shy.
Yeah. Yeah, this resonates with me. I feel sorry for the economist. I feel like that's my gig in life. Most people are there to see the other acts.
Well, maybe one day someone will write about you in,
Yeah.
in that way.
So what as well, you sort of touched upon that he's shy there, and you say at the start as well of the book that writing what's the phrase you use? It's an un-Bergsonian act to write a biography of Bergson, and he ordered all of his papers to be destroyed, his unpublished papers to be destroyed. How difficult was it to piece together this biography? And secondly as well, What was it for you personally that drew you towards writing this book as well?
So I say it's an un-Bergsonian thing to write a biography of Bergson because, first of all, because he himself didn't think that there was anything to be gained by studying the life of thinkers.
Mm.
He said you should this philosophy should be enough, and there's no point in looking at people's lives. He may have been saying that because he knew, because of his celebrity status, he knew that people were sort of trying to get any dirt they could on him. So it might have been a defense mechanism. There's also the sense in which there's a kind of artificial reconstruction of a life, a kind of retrospective way of looking at things when you're doing history or when you're doing a biography that's kind of antithetical to his way of talking about the way life develops and his theory of time. So that was I thought a quite nice point to make because I think that potentially played into why he didn't like biography very much, or at least thought that something's obviously going to be lost in that kind of. And in a way, I tried to stay true to him in the sense that I don't do intellectual biography in this book, in the sense I'm not trying to explain elements of his thinking through events in his life. I treat the events in his life and his thinking as kind of part of his life, but I don't try to draw causal links between these things. I mean, you can tell me if you think that's right. That's what I thought. I was trying to not upset my imaginary Bergson, and that was kind of speaking to me throughout the whole writing process. And so, yeah, as you said, in his will, and he demanded that his papers be destroyed because he knew that people would come sniffing, looking at his correspondence, his papers. And his wife did. His wife, Louise, she burned everything. So that's kind of a nightmare for a biographer. Luckily, because he was so famous, so many things were preserved. People kept his letters. So even if he destroyed his side of the correspondence, there's all the people who had anything with his signature on, kept it. So there is a lot to go on. His writing itself is so beautiful and compelling that I feel like that was one of the reasons why I was drawn to him in the first place. But one of the reasons I wanted to write this book is that I wrote a PhD thesis on him, on a very specific part of his philosophy, which is his philosophy of evolution and thinking
Okay.
about biology. And I did my PhD in Leeds, and so I was surrounded by Anglophone people, English-speaking people who'd never heard of him, which was weird to me because having grown up in France, and philosophy is still a big part of the school curriculum in France. People will have heard of him, most people, even if they don't really know, his name is familiar, whereas in English-speaking countries, not at all. And so I think that was part of it, a general audience book on this figure that has been forgotten, but deserves to be remembered, I think. So that was kind of part of one of the reasons, and also because he was forgotten in part because of a British thinker, Bertrand Russell, who kind
Yeah.
of, we might get into that later as well if you want,
Yeah.
but
His
who kind
nemesis.
of his nemesis, who kind of made a point of discrediting him as much as possible to an English speaking audience. So I wanted to
Yeah.
rectify that a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Was that something that, do you know if that Russell did a lot? I saw a random clip of Russell saying that, criticizing Karl Marx, and I felt it was a little bit reductive. He was saying that his philosophy was a philosophy of hatred. And so I felt, well, that seems like a bit of a, like a quite a cut-in remark. Was that something Russell was famous to do?
Yeah, I think, to be fair to Russell, I do think he was full of amazing insights, but I don't think he was a very good historian of philosophy. And unfortunately, I think I have it behind me somewhere, his massive history of Western
I've
philosophy.
got that, yeah.
Um, it it's just bad history, and it's very much so. He wrote a huge tome. I don't know how many pages, but it's hundreds and hundreds of pages that go from the pre-Socratics to him, essentially. So his school of thought is the kind of ending point of
The
his history,
apotheosis, yeah.
which is convenient. And also, one of his wives was tasked with doing a lot of the research, so he didn't do much of it himself, and it's all very biased, I would say. It's a bit like when scientists write history of science, and then it's like, well, everything was leading up to my discovery of DNA or whatever, you know. It's a bit like that. So I think Russell, I mean, he's the main nemesis, he's the main villain of the book. And so he to me, he did come across as slightly vindictive and someone who had, you know, jealousy in him, very ambitious person, and who was not able to. The way he reads Bergson is similarly to what you're saying about his reading of Marx, very reductive, and just plain wrong. You know, if anyone's read Bergson carefully, they can see that the way Russell deals with him is just misses the point. But it's always good to have a villain in
Yeah.
in a story.
Yeah.
And he's a good one.
So let's get a little bit into some of the ideas that Bergson had. I wonder if we could unpack his philosophy of time and durée, if I'm saying that correctly. My French is very poor. Is that correct? Durée.
Well, that's a very good British way of saying it, I think.
Okay.
And it would be if you were to say durée, if you to do that, it would seem just
no,
really
I can't do that. No. Yeah.
So durée is fine. It's translated as duration, but I don't think that quite works. So I prefer to keep the French. So Bergson's whole philosophical project stemmed from a realization he had when he was writing his PhD thesis. Up until that moment, he had been convinced that he was going to be a philosopher of science, meaning he was going to use philosophy to create a sort of general theory of everything based on scientific findings. And so that was his really ambitious project when he was in his 20s. And he started looking at all the different concepts of mechanics of the time of physics. And it's when he started looking at time, this is the way he tells it, that he realized that the time in the T in the equations of physics doesn't contain any temporality at all. It's a kind of detemporalized time. And so that set him on a completely different course, because then he started noticing it everywhere, that every time we're talking about time, we're actually talking about something quite different. We've replaced temporality with spatial terms. So every time to talk about something in constant flux, like movement, like time, we have to freeze it. We have to treat it like something that's immobile. So minutes on a clock, points on a graph, the letter T in an equation. These are all sophisticated ways of freezing the continuous flow of time. And one way that's quite helpful to sort of think about what he's trying to get at is he has this thought experiment in his first book, Time and Free Will, which was his dissertation, where he imagines that there's some magic that means that time accelerates to the point that instead of a day going by in 24 hours, it's 12 hours, and everything else accelerates proportionally. And the effect of that would be that to the astrophysicist's equations, it would make no difference. All the proportions would be preserved. But to the astrophysicist experiencing this shift in tempo, it would make a huge difference. You would realize in that position that there's a difference in the storing up of your experience between sunrise and sunset. It would be something qualitative that would change. And he says that this is precisely what we have to get rid of when we are measuring or even just talking about change, time. And so most of what we call time is actually time contaminated by space. We treat minutes as kind of interchangeable units, whereas he wants to get at that it's a little bit more fluid. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So one of the ways he has of expressing what he means by durée, time, so durée would be time not contaminated by space. What would that even look like? And how would you even express it? Because what he's saying is that even language, concepts, words are also having this solidifying effect on something that's a flux. When you conceptualize anything, you're basically freezing it into a box. So in order to tidy up basically the overwhelming diversity of reality, and in order to measure something that's in flux like time, we have to solidify using symbols and concepts. And one way Bergson has of trying to convey these ideas that kind of escape conceptualization is to use more imaged language. So he likes to talk about durée in terms of melody, comparing it to music. So music can be transcribed into a succession of symbols, and these symbols can be juxtaposed, spatially on the page. And on the sheet of paper, you can erase, you can move around things, something that, and every unit sort of, represents the same thing. Two A notes on the page are the same thing. Whereas in your experience of listening to the music, you don't hear a succession of individual notes. You hear a swelling, something that is harmonious, something that's growing together. And if a single note were to be displaced, it would just be a different melody. Nothing is interchangeable in the experience. And that is one way that Bergson has to convey what's going on in our inner life. We tend, with language, the language we use, and that's very useful and that we need, it kind of tricks us into thinking of moments in our lived experience as those notes on the page that are kind of interchangeable. And we tend to think of events placed in a certain order with clear cut before and after. I was hungry, but then I ate, and then I was no longer hungry. I used to be a child, and now I'm an adult. But how would you really pinpoint that moment when you stopped being a child and started being an adult? Those who are attentive to what's really happening in inner life will see that the changes that are occurring within consciousness are not mere transitions between otherwise static and stable states. It's actually, everything is constantly transforming in consciousness. And that is what he's trying to get at with Durée, especially in his first book, is the way in which we're constantly growing and advancing, and that we kind of carry all of our experience with us. And another way of looking at it, another kind of imaged way of looking at it, is a snowball. So instead of looking at time as a line, you could think of a snowball rolling down a hill and accumulating snow. Our personality accumulates experience. So time that passes isn't time lost, but it's time gained. You sort of gain more and more experience. So that's the entry point, I think, to starting to see what he's getting at with Durée.
I love that phrase, time is not lost, but time gained. Is very beautiful reframing. And I can see how this Bergson's approach to lived time versus measured time, maybe you can conceptualize that way a bit, was freeing for people, because he's speaking about the spark of creative evolution and force over rigid mechanical living. How does this connect to freedom and free will?
So his first book, Time and Free Will, is a discussion of the problem of free will. And Durée is kind of one of the central idea, the new idea that he's developing. But actually, when he defended his thesis, the examiners were way more interested in what he had to say about these classic debates about free will, and they kind of missed the whole Durée original point he was making. But one of the ideas he tries to get across is that, in the 19th century, early 20th century, there were schools of thought that were trying to argue that there could be a way of treating human thought as something as predictable or something as mechanical as the physical world, say. And against this idea, this completely deterministic way of viewing the mind, Bergson shows that because in consciousness, in Durée, two causes never present themselves twice. So I'll backtrack a little bit. Because of this flow and because of this snowball effect of Durée, you never live the same moment twice. Even if you are every day doing exactly the same thing, sitting in the same chair, looking at the same screen, it's going to every time be different by virtue of the fact that you've lived it before. So, your consciousness is transforming at every instant. In order for there to be determinism, there has to be something like the same cause presenting itself for there to be the same effect. And this just simply doesn't happen in consciousness. So that's kind of one of his arguments. And I'm not really doing it justice. Obviously, it's more complicated than that and it's more subtle than that. But yes, this idea of durée is actually a condition of what he views as absolute free will. Free will is possible, but we rarely access it because we rarely access that deep inner flow. We're often conditioned by the more mechanical aspects of social life, the more the more superficial version of ourself that is practice oriented and that needs to get us through the day. And we basically speak in cliches. We see our own selves through these sort of ready-made concepts, and it's only by going deeper than that that true choice and true free will becomes possible. So that's kind of which I think is a really deep point, a really interesting point of his philosophy, that free will is absolutely possible, but it's a very rare occurrence, true free will. It's a really good, I really like that take.
Yeah, that's a lovely take. Hello there, just a quick pause to say if you're enjoying the Bardo podcast and you want to keep it going, best way to do that is at patreon.com/the Bardo podcast. There's also a link in the description. You can give £5 a month or whatever you like, and it genuinely does help me and keep making these. Thanks to all those people who are supporting already, I really appreciate it. All right, let's get back to the conversation. I wonder if we could move on a little bit now to Bergson, how he treated memory. You spoke earlier about this, how it's you used the metaphor of a snowball, about how things collect, and how did that relate to duration for Bergson?
So there's this sense in which we carry the whole of our experience with us at all times, but the reason that when we don't have access to it at all times is because we are practical, we're practically oriented, and so the brain serves as a kind of interface that will bring to the fore the memories that we need the most in any given time. And that's why it's in moments of when we are disinterested, so when we're dreaming, when we're daydreaming, when what Bergson calls our attention to life is actually at its lowest. Those are the moments when some memories are just going to, really deep ones, are going to float back up. And that's why, and he was really fascinated with the idea of your life flashing before your eyes, all these documented moments of near-death experiences where people, and he says, well, actually, when you think you're about to die, that is probably the moment when your attention to life is gone the most, and perhaps that would explain why you get these phenomena. Anyway, the reason he got started is because there were so many theories at the time where people were starting to say, here's a map, we can map onto the brain places where different kinds of memories are stored. And Bergson didn't like this kind of spatial way of thinking about memory because he viewed consciousness, and in a way, for Bergson, consciousness is just memory. It's kind of consciousness is the ability to look back and to anticipate the future. Sort of, it's at the but so memory is a huge part of what consciousness is made of, and it's not something that's spatial. That's why he went into so much detail into all these theories of brain pathology. So people who forget how to speak after a brain injury, or who can't understand certain words, or that kind of thing, aphasia, that was used as evidence that there are places in the brain where things are located. And Bergson is saying that doesn't prove that things are located in certain places. It just shows that the pathway has been severed. So our brain is the machine that is allowing certain memories to pass through, or to, selecting which memories are the most useful, but that doesn't mean that they're physically stored. What were you the most interested in memory? Because I feel like I've just gone off onto like this biological stuff that I find really fascinating, but it might not be.
Well, I think my question is probably, unfortunately for you, was around this, like what would Bergson make of sort of the epiphenomenal idea of maybe consciousness arising from the brain, and how does that relate to his ideas around memory? Yeah.
Well, he has this idea of the brain as an instrument, again, it's always about saying that stop thinking of yourself, human, as this pure intellect, and think of yourself more as an organism that is the product of an evolutionary history, and our brains are a sophisticated development in this evolutionary history. So memory has to do with, and it's going to bring us back to freedom. It starts with perception. So the most simple organisms, there's no real delay between something that they perceive and the reaction to it. So if you think of a unicellular organism, it's going to react immediately, and there's no latency. I don't know if that's a word in English. It's a French word, latence.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's when nervous systems start developing a kind of a distinction between central and peripheral nervous system, and then there's the moment of latency between something that you perceive and then the reaction to it. That's where freedom kind of can emerge, and that's where memory comes into play, because you're going to have the ability to reach back into past experience and then anticipate what is going to happen. And so the more nervous systems become complex, the more this indeterminate space grows. And so humans, we are basically potentially the organisms with the most indetermination, because we are able to not only reach back into our own memories, but into the kind of memories of our whole species through, our ability to externalize memory through writing, through history. And then we also have the furthest reach into imagined possibilities, which can be a big problem. That's why so many people have anxiety, really, is because we're able to imagine any and all possibilities. And so memory is this space where freedom comes from, really, because that's where choice becomes possible. So that's one. So that didn't quite answer your question, but then to go back to sort of the brain, and I think I touched on it a bit, but the brain isn't what stores memory. The brain isn't what produces memories. Bergson compares it to, how telephones worked 100 years ago, where you would, I don't even quite know how it worked, but you would have an operator who would put the connection through for you.
Yeah.
That's what the brain is, basically. The brain is the interface where, perception, and it's going to reach and it's going to find the right, but it's not storing the memory. And so if you start thinking of memories as not being stored, it's very difficult because we are accustomed to thinking of things spatially. And so it's like, what are these memories just free floating in something that's not space? We just can't conceptualize that. But Bergson is saying consciousness is not the same as brain, essentially.
I'm not going to be able to go into this because it's too much, but there is in Yogacara, there's a Buddhist philosophy, a particular type, which talks about this notion of storehouse consciousness, which is like a non-local indeterminate potentiality. So maybe that's one way of also conceptualizing this memory field, although it's not an actual thing or a place, perhaps. It's non-spatial. It's very difficult to conceive this, isn't it? Because of, as you said, the way we spatialize and with our concepts. And maybe that, so in the way that you're talking about all this stuff, it just made me think about what you said earlier about Bergson's project was to maybe go beyond our regular cliches and concepts to get into that state, perhaps that potentiality, which is where our freedom then exists.
Yeah. I think that's a nice way of putting it.
I wonder, because I think that moves us into laughter, which was obviously something I'm interested in. I discussed this in another episode with one-liner comedian Marc Salmon. We spoke about Bergson's theory of laughter. A phrase that I really like is that it is a sort of almost like a social corrective about the mechanical encrusted on the living. I really like that phrase. Could you explain what he meant by that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So is it okay if I go back a little bit and explain why he gets into all of it? Because it comes as a bit of a surprise in his, if you look at his writing, and it kind of seems like the odd one out, this book on laughter, where he's done very serious work on freedom, on memory, and then in between the book on memory and life, you get this book on laughter. And I think one of the crucial things to understand why he suddenly got really interested in this topic that so many philosophers have dismissed as, it's the kind of topic that people don't take very seriously, is because Bergson determined that it was a really interesting, one of the rare places where the biological and the cultural intersect perfectly, where there's this real meeting point of evolution and then our art and our culture. So I think that to me is credit to him for kind of taking seriously something that should be taken seriously, paradoxically. I think laughter is it's one of those things that really is interesting about humans. And it's one of the best things about being a human as well. But so he takes it very seriously as a philosophical topic. His book is not funny, as you would expect. Sort of dissecting laughter is not a good opportunity to there's the real theoretical, and it's quite boring as well, because he goes through lots and lots of examples, and most of them are taken from kind of 18th century French theatre or things like that. So you have to get through the whole thing is a bit of a bit much, but he has some really interesting insights at the beginning of the book, where he says, I don't want to define laughter, because something so vital, in the sense something that has so much vitality, is not going to lend itself well to conceptual rigid definition. And so he treats it as something, he says we must treat it with the respect we owe to life. So he treats it like a living phenomenon. And he almost treats it like he's a field biologist observing it in its natural habitat. And so he starts out by trying to figure out where we find laughter, how and when and why does it occur. And he determines that it's an eminently social and human phenomenon. He says all these things seem obvious, but that they're worth, noticing, because they then tell us something really deep about laughter. So he says that we only laugh at human things, and that even if we're laughing at an animal, it's because we're anthropomorphizing it. Even if we laugh at a hat on its own. It's because we're imagining how stupid the head would look in the hat. He says that laughter requires us to dim our emotional response. So
Mm.
you won't be at the moment you're laughing. You're not going to be feeling strong pity, melancholy, rage, fear. You can pass between, you can go from one to the other quite quickly, but the moment you're actually laughing, it's dimming all of those things. And in this logic, that perhaps explains why humor is so cathartic, because it kind of forces us to take briefly even a detached perspective on things. I think that's a really important point, even though again it seems quite obvious. And feel free to interrupt me because you're the comedian here. So and then the third thing he observes is that laughter always requires an echo. So there's a real social bonding aspect to laughter. Even when you're laughing on your own, you're imagining a community around you. When you're laughing at a YouTube video on your own, you're laughing with the person you're watching. That you're not. There's never solo laughter. There's always an imagined community of humans, and feel free to disagree with or find counterexamples to any of these.
Yeah.
But the point of all of this is to say we laugh at what's human, and it's a communal experience because it serves a social function, and there's kind of an evolutionary explanation for laughter. So there's the evolutionary, probably physiological explanation for laughter. That's one thing, but then there's a more cultural evolution, maybe explanation, or human evolution explanation, which has to do with the way in which living organisms have to adapt to the obstacles that they're presented with, or they perish. And the same goes for society. For a society to function, there has to be mechanisms in place, or there has to be ways in which the things that could be dangerous to the society are kind of tempered down. Otherwise, the society collapses. And the things that laughter corrects aren't really life or death, aspects of society. But if they were left too unchecked, it would be bad for the society. So for society to function, it requires of its individuals a certain elasticity, a certain adaptability. And laughter kind of is in place to make sure that people retain that elasticity and don't become too set in their ways. And that's kind of at the heart of the idea of the mechanical encrusted on the living. And again, Bergson is not defining laughter. He's saying this is a tendency I've noticed. This is a leitmotif that keeps repeating itself in the various kinds of comedy that I've studied, in the various things that make us laugh. But this does not mean that it's the only reason or way that laughter occurs, and it's not the sole definition, but it's definitely something that is a tendency within that phenomenon. So the idea is for the delicate adjustment of people's wills in society. If someone is has too much vanity, and if too many people have too much vanity, too much ego, we end up with a society of tech bros that are trying to, and so it's very important that we can laugh at these horrible people. Unfortunately, they seem to have no shame, and maybe this is the point where actually our society is breaking down because laughter's not working anymore. But in theory, the idea is we laugh at people who show too much vanity. We naturally find people with vanity ridiculous because that is an attitude that is not conducive to a good society. It's in the same way that. So we don't only laugh at things that are morally reprehensible, because if you think of Ned Flanders, he's very funny because he's so rigid in his ways. He's funny because he never deviates from his Ned Flanderness. And that also is something that if everyone was so rigid, it again wouldn't be conducive to the pliableness that's necessary for for people to adapt to one another and to the society. So
Mm.
there's lots of, and then that is why when we encounter, according to Bergson, when we encounter in the world a place where there should have been the kind of elegant vitality of life, so something gracious should have happened, and then instead someone slips and falls. It's that lack of adaptability that suscitates laughter, because that's the function of laughter. So we're not
Mm.
always trying to correct things when we laugh, but that's the tendency, because its ultimate goal is to correct and punish, in a sense. Does that make sense? It's not
Yeah.
always doing that, but that's one of its functions.
Yeah. It makes sense. I actually think it's quite. Yeah, I'm just thinking for examples now. I have examples of when I'm laughed on my own.
Hmm.
Um, I don't. Maybe I'm just a psychopath though. I don't know,
But
but
but when you're laughing on your own, are you
yeah,
not? Because when I laugh on my own, when I laugh at
yeah,
myself, if I do something stupid, or I laugh, I do think there's a level at which I'm imagining someone else's, or I'm imagining that I'm sharing. Maybe not consciously imagining, but I'm laughing um, with an imagined partner or audience
yeah, or
somehow.
maybe even an imagined self as well. Like
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
sat,
that you're.
yeah, that you're in dialogue with. I've
Yeah.
definitely sat meditating and just had a moment where I don't know why I'm laughing. I'm just suddenly laughing, and I feel like it's a laughter of realization. Maybe I'm noticing my own mechanistic, and it erupts into laughter. I don't know.
Mm.
There's a
That
release
sounds
in
quite
it.
nice.
Yeah, um, yeah. It upsets everyone else at the temple, but there is another thing as well in improv, comedy, and sketch. They talk about the game of the scene, and that is a repeatable pattern. And the way that you described Ned Flanders there is like that's what people are doing when they're creating a comedy sketch. Often is they have a ridiculous character who is just rigid in their things.
Mm,
So, for example, the Monty Python sketch where he just refuses to admit that this parrot is dead, and
mm.
that's where it comes from, that mechanistic. So I can see that. Um, yeah, but what I found empowering about these ideas is that if it serves a social function, that means that laughter can banish antisocial behaviour in a sense, and that feels empowering as a comedian. That maybe sometimes your silly jokes, maybe they're serving a function.
Yeah, I mean, it's no coincidence that all fascists hate being laughed at, and
Yeah,
that most people who aren't fascists are kind of okay with being, like, can take a joke, whereas the people who are the worst at taking a joke are fascist, even though they're always talking about snowflakes and they're always talking about um, political correctness, but actually they're the ones who fear laughter the most.
yeah,
Um, that I think is really reveals something, and is where a lot of the power of laughter lies. It's an extremely powerful thing, and it keeps. In theory, it should help us keep power in check. Really. Um,
yeah.
so yeah, you're
I
doing important work.
Thank you. So Bergson speaks a lot about intuition, which maybe we can
Mhm.
unpack a little bit
Yeah.
more in a minute. But did he have any methods for getting beyond these kind of fixed concepts and cliches and getting towards our deeper free self?
Mm. He is not able to describe a clear methodology of how to access, your pure durée. Um, but what he does is he tries to put the reader on the track of what he's getting at by using, rather than using rigid concepts, using very well chosen metaphors or images. Um, the way he describes it is, it's almost like an ability to briefly, it's fleeting moments, almost briefly undo all the habits of thought and catch a glimpse of something. That's kind of how um it's almost a violent thing that you have to do to your own mind in the way he describes it, because inevitably you're going to be using your intellectual faculties in order to do this. But luckily for him, according to him, the intellect is not the only way of apprehending the world, and so it's possible to kind of, it's almost like catching your intellect off guard and capturing, it's he calls it almost infra intellectual, I think he uses at one point term. So the whole point is that it's something that you kind of have to figure out for yourself, and the philosopher who writes well can put you on the right track, kind of thing, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. It's very similar to the sort of Buddhist project where we use pith instructions or pointers, because these states this way of being in the world is ineffable in some sense, because it isn't accessed through the intellect. It's accessed through a different type of knowing, which doesn't invalidate that type of knowing either. It's just perhaps we've put too much emphasis on concepts and intellect to describe reality.
Well, that's precisely Bergson's point as well, is to say that we absolutely need our concepts, and we absolutely need this our capacity to measure, because otherwise, what would we be doing? How would we function? How would we express ourselves? But what he is saying is that so interestingly for him, the intellect and science and all of these conceptual ways of looking at things, they're not in the tradition of sort of the grandiose Western histories of philosophy. It's not this kind of pure intellectual endeavor. It's actually a very practice-oriented thing. So concepts are tools in the same way that physical tools are tools. They're just they're sort of intellectual extensions of our physical tools. And it's actually, philosophy and metaphysics is this practice that is completely what he calls disinterested. So it's not oriented towards any practice. It's not seeking practical results. And that's what allows the philosopher to sort of access this infra-intellectual state. Whereas the scientists have to keep on doing, we need them to keep doing their thing as well. Because he was often accused of being anti-science, which was the opposite, quite the opposite.
Hello there, quick break to let you know that I've started a small online meditation group on the 2nd and 4th Sundays online. No experience necessary, all are welcome. We've done a couple so far, they've been really very nice. Good way to start a Sunday, very wholesome. If you'd like to join, just you can find me on Instagram at marcsalmoncomedy.com or through the Patreon. Send me a message and I'll send you some more details. Let's get back to the chat. With Bergson, another thing I really liked was the way that you describe Bergson's, it's his second book, isn't it? Creative Evolution, was it his second book?
Third book. So
third book, sorry.
After Matter and Memory, Creative Evolution, yeah.
Yeah, and the Élan vital, again, excuse my French if that sounds terrible.
Beautiful.
Okay. So could we maybe talk a little bit about what he was trying to challenge, perhaps, and maybe get onto the concept of the Élan vital?
Yeah, so crucially, the Élan vital isn't a concept. It's what he calls an image, and he says it's the image kind of taken from the physical world that best encompasses all the different aspects of life that he's trying to describe. Bergson believes that the intellect isn't the only way of accessing reality, by saying, and actually he's going to use the evolutionary history of humans to try and challenge that. And I think it's a really cool move, actually, that was sort of new, or the way he did it was new, to say, well, we can't separate ourselves from this history, this history of life. We're parts of that, and so our intellect itself has a history. And so paradoxically, he uses evolution to explain why we are bad at understanding evolution, or we're bad at understanding things in flux. That's really it. He's trying to say, It seems to be possible to think outside the intellect, but first let's try and understand where the intellect comes from, or how it came to be. And again, he's trying to put intelligence in its place. He's trying to say this isn't this pure faculty of beautiful, pure knowledge. It's a practice. Again, I keep saying it, but it's a practice-oriented faculty. It's something that arose from our need to survive. It's a adaptation. It's a survival strategy that one of the paths that life has taken throughout the course of its evolution, and it's something that has allowed us as a species to mold inner matter to our advantage and use our external environment to survive. In that sense, as our intellect developed, it kind of kept that mold of the matter that it was confronting. So our concepts are spatial because of that. And so we are never going to be able to escape that spatializing tendency of the intellect. So if we start to try and explain biological evolution through rigid concepts, we're always going to fail, or at least we're always going to be limited. We might produce interesting, important theories that help us in a practical sense and help us kind of categorize, and that's a really important part of science is understanding the elements of the world, but we're always going to miss something. So, for example, the notions of reproduction and individuality in biology are really hard to you can't fit any one thing in these rigid categories. If you it's very hard to say where the individual begins and ends in organisms that reproduce, in the same way that it's very difficult to say where adolescence starts and where ends and adulthood starts, if you see what I mean. So they're important, useful categories, but we need something beyond that, or under that comes from another place, to be able to really look at life. And that's where intuition comes in. And so in creative evolution, he's kind of going to posit that intuition is possible because evolution is kind of a branching movement. And we, in the same way that we carry our whole memory, personal memory within us, we carry the whole history of evolution within us as an organism. And so we carry the more instinctive tendencies of animal life before us. And it's, to say it very rapidly and very simplistically, it's going to be the way that instinct is able to look at life internally, but then enlightened by the kind of self-reflexive abilities of the intellect. That's what is going to make intuition possible. But so all of that to say that's where that's the project.
Yeah.
And in the first chapter of the book, and this is where everyone gets, well, that's what everyone focused on. He has this image of the Élan vital, which is his attempt to produce something like a fluid concept, so something that is not as rigid as the concepts that biologists have to use because they're doing biology. He's disinterested doing philosophy, so he produces this idea of élan vital, which is one of many images he uses in the book, but it's one that in French, élan, the word élan, carries lots of meanings, both taken from the world of psychology. So you can have an élan of generosity, so a kind of something that kind of, a surge of generosity. You can have, you can speak of the élan of a city, and it's kind of the general vibe and, abstract movement of the city. And then in physical terms, élan means, gaining momentum before a jump. It means, this kind of accumulated energy and then movement forward. And so he's relying on the fact that all of these connotations exist within the term élan, which again in English was translated as impetus, which doesn't really carry all of those different connotations. And that's one of the other limitations of language is language is already a translation of something that is difficult to translate, and then when it's translated again, it's even you miss even more. And so the élan vital is Bergson's way of representing life as something that is both unpredictable, and then it's in that sense that it's creative. So he's going against the idea that that you could have a kind of deterministic view of evolution, um, and creative meaning unpredictable. Creativity for Bergson means that you produce something of which the elements weren't present before it was produced, um, and so evolution is creative. It comes from one original source, so it's one burst that then goes into lots of different directions. So that's where the Élan idea comes from, and then all these psychological connotations of the Élan also come into play, because you can kind of metaphorically think of life as memory in the same way that you think of our consciousness as memory. So
Yeah.
it's this original impulse that then takes lots of different directions. um, I can keep going for hours, so please stop me, because it's just hard to succinctly.
Well, something I think you used a really nice image from Bergson in the book about the shell exploding, and then that
Mm.
shell explodes into other shells and so on, which helped me to sort of wrap my mind about it. So the élan vital it's not a thing, is it? It's more of like a, would you say, creative impulse?
Yeah, it's not. It's certainly not a um, vital force in the sense that the so if late 19th, early 20th century vitalism, more 19th century, that say we have to posit some kind of immaterial force to
Yeah.
explain life, because the laws of matter aren't enough to explain life. That's not quite what Bergson's getting at. Bergson is more getting at the fact that um, life appears to be in tension with matter. There seems to be two sides of the same coin kind of thing going on, where you have the tendency of matter to kind of be if you're thinking of thermodynamics, kind of tends toward disorganization, and then life seems to tend towards organization, and it's the confrontation between these two tendencies that define life in a sense. I think what's important to understand is that Bergson is not trying to oppose a alternative theory of evolution to all the biologists who are doing theories of evolution, even though he does discuss them at length and he critiques them. In the end, he's saying, well, they're bound to be limited in what they're able to say, because, again, they're doing science, and that's the way science works. Um, the Élan Vital has more of this. It allows us to look at life outside of these constraints, conceptual constraints, and really see it as this unified movement. That, as you said, that image of the kind of bomb exploding into other bombs that explode into other bombs. It's this kind of impulse that has no predetermined end, but that has this kind of tendency towards more freedom, and it's kind of an attempt to liberate itself from matter. And it rarely succeeds, in the same way that our free will rarely expresses itself. Life rarely succeeds, and is often, if you look at the history of life, there are so many points where lineages just stop, or where there are species that kind of stop evolving and just kind of stay ossified in a certain form. And there are very few lines of evolution that kind of kept going, or that were able to keep pushing the boundaries of what freedom can be. And so Bergson says, in that sense, humans are kind of exceptional, because it seems that we're the line that has pushed freedom the furthest, but nothing predestined that. And again, we're just carrying the whole of the history of life. It's not like we came out of nowhere.
You mention the ballet dancer. There's like an image of a ballet dancer,
Mm.
and so it's one fluid movement that can't be separated into its parts, and that obviously brings us back to Durée as well, like this flow, this ongoing flow. With this ballet, is the Élan Vital then almost like a dance between matter and, not soul or spirit, or what you know, is that what's happening?
It's yeah, that's a really nice way of thinking about it. Um, what he's trying to say is that any any attempt that any organism or any species has ever had to survive, and every failure to adapt, it's the manifestation of the same
Hmm.
movement. It's
Yeah, I like
it's an
that.
initial thrust that then kind of branches out, um, and there's something like a dance, a confrontation between this kind of, metaphorically speaking, you can think of it as kind of a thrust of pure freedom or pure creativity, but then it's confronted to the opposite movement, um, and that's actually where creativity comes into play. It's the confrontation between freedom and spontaneity, and then the inertia of matter, and it's in the ways that life has found to get around or undo this inertia that creativity is possible. It's that difficult relationship in a sense. But again, there's not in life. There's not life without matter. Matter is always is a part. It's not a vitalistic theory in the sense that there's a kind of separate um, life force that it's almost as if it's the sense in which you can't get a poem without confronting that kind of artistic intuition with, or I don't know if intuition is the right term, but that artistic thrust, that artistic sense with the limitations of language, or the limitations of what language permits. And it's only in that moment that you have the creative um, product. I need to reread my own book. You know, when you write a book and it's been out for a year and a half now, which means that I finished writing it over 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And I've done my best to forget all about it because it's, traumatic experience writing a book. Um,
Yeah.
and so and so it's funny because I'm sure if I reread it, I would think, oh yeah, no, there's a much simpler way of putting all of this. And it's almost like I'm having to redo the work of like taking these difficult ideas and condensing them. And
Maybe this is the point though, because these are ideas of flux and flow that,
yeah,
it's not easy to conceptualize. But I do think you're pointing us towards it. For me, I,
hopefully.
I'm thinking of it as I don't know if this is maybe right, but just what it evokes for me is like an interplay between not, I don't want to say spirit, but like, yeah, like this creativity and matter. That it's not like, as you said, a life force that animates things, but it is the interplay between the two, between that. And what I liked when I was reading it was that it comes from that initial impulse, which then spreads out, and then, and we're the echo of that. And I really
Hmm.
like that. I felt a
Hmm.
sense of union with others in that.
That was such a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah. I like the echo image in particular.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, there's a real, I guess Bergson also has this thing of, you can look at the whole history of life in the same way as you look at the history of an individual, in terms of consciousness, in terms of durée, therefore kind of in terms of consciousness, because the line between what durée and consciousness are is quite difficult to trace. It's because where there is consciousness is the ability to remember and the ability to anticipate, and so
Mm.
that exists in lots of degrees, really. And but you can almost think of life as a whole, as that kind of movement as well. So I think that's something that was kind of characteristic of late 19th century thinking of evolution in psychological terms. That's not only Bergson, but I think the way he is able to elevate that, and think very seriously about the relationship between life and matter, and as you say, life not being an animating force, but being a kind of, almost, it's almost like he's thinking in terms of more like tendency. So there's a tendency, a movement going in one direction and a movement going in another direction, and it's kind of that confrontation that allows for all the beautiful things that we know and we're all part of. And it kind of is quite humbling, and I think a lot of what he is trying to do is also to say it's kind of bullshit to think of there's a way in which philosophers and the Western tradition has a way of looking at itself as this noble endeavor, and it's like, well, actually, we're all about survival, really, and and everything we've ever conceptualized initially, it was a tool for survival. It wasn't this disinterested, beautiful thing.
What I was interested in is the mystical themes of his work. And his last, what was the name of his last book? Sorry, again, can you remember?
The two sources of morality and religion.
Right. And he starts to explore Catholic mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found particularly relevant to now is his idea of politics and the open society.
Mm-hmm.
And so he wrote about open and closed societies. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that distinction and what that might
Yeah,
mean for now.
yeah, absolutely. So Matter and Memory came out in the 30s at a time when most people had forgotten about that, or not, perhaps not forgotten about him, but he was definitely no longer um, as present in the public eye as he had been. And it came at a time, so 1932. So he would, he'd seen two wars already, because there was the 1870 war against Prussia, then World War One, and then World War Two was on the way, and that there were definite rumblings of Hitler was about to take power and kind of thing. So Bergson definitely had war on his mind, and he was thinking about. So it's a really, again, a really rich book. It took him a quarter of a century to write, and he explores all sorts of things, but he's trying to think about how. So one of the central questions is, why is there war? It's not the central question of the book, but and essentially war happens when societies close upon themselves so much that they're no longer able to regard the other as a fellow human. That's a really simplified way of putting it. But there's closed and open society, and closed and then it's like, oh, I've forgotten the terms now for religion. It's not open and closed religion, but it's and so Bergson is interested in, as you said, mysticism, because he sees the mystics as people who are able to go beyond something that seems to be kind of really difficult for most of us to go beyond, which is we value the people close to us more, and then we maybe value the people in our country, and then we value the people furthest from us. There seems to be a tendency amongst humans to have that kind of hierarchy and the mystics, and by mystic he includes people like Socrates, Jesus, and all sorts of people, seem to have a kind of direct link to something like the Élan vital, something like a purer form of love, perhaps, and seem to be able to are those who are able to guide the rest of us towards more openness that is necessary to not fall into all the worst forms of stuff that we do as humans. But mysticism is also interesting to him because obviously he's interested in these sub-conceptual, non-linguistic ways of accessing reality, and I think he ends up seeing in mystics or certain forms of mysticism ways in which that might be possible. And what is really interesting about that book, I'm actually trying to find the quote now, because it's a quote that when I read it to people, people say, oh, when was that written? Oh, it was written in the 1930s. But it sounds quite. So he's talking about. It's in the final section of the book. So this is even before the atom bomb, but he's talking about the destructive capabilities of technology developing too fast for our ethics to be able to keep up. And this is actually the quote I found here was actually not in the book. It was in his Nobel speech, because he was given the Nobel Prize for literature. But I'll just read it because it's really striking. He says, "If the 19th century made tremendous progress in mechanical inventions, it too often assumed that these inventions would raise the moral level of mankind. Increasing experience has proved, on the contrary, that the technological development of a society does not automatically result in the moral perfection of the men living in it, and that an increase in the material means at the disposal of humanity may even present dangers unless it's accompanied by a corresponding spiritual effort. To take only the most striking example, one might have expected that the use of steam and electricity by diminishing distances would by itself bring about a moral rapprochement between peoples. Today we know that this was not the case, and that antagonisms, far from disappearing, will risk being aggravated if a spiritual progress, a greater effort towards brotherhood, is not accomplished." So he's talking about steam and electricity bringing people together. Obviously, you can think of, oh yeah, social media, people have never been more connected. It's a cliche to say, but we've never been more disconnected. But yeah, that's kind of the point. It's that we have all these advances, but we are not adapting quick enough to them, or we're not taking the time to think about what it actually means to be a good human being, what it means to care for one another. And this kind of increase in mechanization is actually a huge danger, because we're not taking it. We're not able to really fully digest it.
There was a moment that you speak about towards the end of the book with Bergson's clash with Einstein about time. What was the sort of disagreement there?
So this arrived at a moment when Bergson was already extremely established. He'd almost gone over his peak already a little bit at this point in the early 1920s, and Einstein was kind of up and coming. And Bergson took Einstein's work very seriously. He was one of the few people who could probably read it and understand to the best of his ability, because he was someone who was very mathematically literate and scientifically literate. And what happened was Einstein was invited in 1922 to speak before the French Philosophical Society, and he was confronted with all these French philosophers asking him questions like, what is the link between relativity and Kant, Kant's philosophy. So Einstein wasn't having a great time. And so Bergson was dragged into the conversation kind of against his will, because the person who'd organized the event was panicking and thinking, this isn't going well at all, so let's get big shot Mr. Time to talk about the other big shot Mr. Time. And so Bergson, as he did, improvised this long he just sort of he spoke for about 30 minutes apparently in French.
Yeah.
And the point he was trying to make was, I don't disagree with any of the mathematics of relativity or the theory itself, but ultimately, once the physicist is done speaking, the philosopher still has a lot to say. I think that's one way of summing it up without betraying too much that I don't know enough about the physics to really be able to explain what was at stake. And Einstein, whose French wasn't very good, kind of had this really famous one-liner where he said, "The time of the philosopher doesn't exist," and just shut him down. And that gave rise to lots of satellite debates. So Bergson himself had written a book on relativity, in which he got some things wrong. But also that point he was making, he made, and he engaged very seriously with Einstein, whereas Einstein did not give Bergson the time of day, didn't engage with his work seriously at all. And in the end, it was kind of decided that Einstein had won the debate, and how this kind of cemented and was kind of one of the inciting events of the scientist being seen as the person who has more authority than any other kind of theoretician, combined. That's kind of something that starts in the early 20th century to be really cemented. And the way this played out kind of translates that. And I think Bergson was really frustrated because he felt like he'd never been taken seriously enough for his ideas to be engaged with in the way that he'd engaged with the science.
Mm.
And that's something was a recurring thing for him. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting throughout the book, the trajectory of Bergson's life, where, as you said at the start, his ideas were inspiring to people in ways that he may not necessarily have said himself. So it was taken up by, revolutionary syndicalists, as you said, but as time went on, I think there was a conservative period during the war where he became quite nationalistic with France. And so many criticisms started to develop from the left, from the anti-Semitic right, but not just that. One of the strongest criticisms was from logical positivism, and that brings us to his, as we characterised him, his nemesis, Bertrand Russell, I think you make the case unfairly, possibly dismissed him as anti-science. He was a very, what was it that Russell reacted and analytic philosophers reacted so strongly against with Bergson?
So again, to villainize Russell to my best ability, one of the things that Russell didn't like about Bergson was that he was highly successful and popular. Russell was a young up and coming philosopher still, so there was definitely professional jealousy that can be, is documented in Russell's correspondence to his mistress at the time, where he's just like, "What's going on with this guy? He's so annoying. Why does everyone care about him so much?" There was the added insult that Russell's presidential address to the Aristotelian Society was moved so that Bergson could attend. I really do think that played a part in his response to Bergson, but obviously philosophically they couldn't be more different in a sense, or opposed. In a sense, I think they maybe come from both of them both of their way of seeing things maybe stem from a similar anxiety, sort of analytic philosophy. There's a lot of anxiety about language and what language can express in the early 20th century, and the limits of language. And I think perhaps that anxiety just, could be taken off into lots of different directions. And to be really simplistic about it, the analytic philosophers or the logical positivists took it one way, saying, well, we have to reduce language to kind of its atomic particles, so that we can make sure that we're always describing the world of physics without any ambiguity whatsoever. Whereas Bergson is saying it's actually the more abstract you become, or the more conceptual become, the more further removed from reality you actually are. So there's this completely different way of dealing with the problem, but I do think it's a similar anxiety about that problem of the limits of what language can do, and the ways in which it might trick us, or it might, take us down bad intellectual routes. And so Russell, belonging to the more analytic camp, obviously didn't like someone who was saying, well, concepts can't really do much for us as philosophers. We actually need to, to think outside all sorts of boxes. But so he accused Bergson of being anti science, and he accuses him of being completely mathematically illiterate, which is so wrong, because Bergson was kind of a mathematical prodigy. When he was a teenager, he solved a problem that the French polymath Blaise Pascal had left without a solution in the 17th century, and then teenage Bergson just casually solved it. It's just wrong to think of him as someone who thought science was bad or whatever, or that we should dismiss rationality altogether. We should dismiss intellect. In fact, he's someone who takes it, who praises it and sees it as something very valuable, but not sufficient to understand the world. And yeah, someone like Russell just paints him as not only so scientifically illiterate, and then I think he goes as far as to say that thinkers like Bergson, with that kind of what he sees as a kind of romantic, wishy-washy streak, are responsible for fascism. You know, the rise of fascism in Europe, which
Yeah.
again, that's a really simplistic take. There are elements of maybe vitalism in some ways that there's definitely interesting history of ideas to do there, but to trace a line between Bergson and fascism is very much a stretch for sure. And that's Russell's way.
Yeah, I don't know who this quote is. It's something like someone said they were talking about their books, and they said, "My books are like a mirror. If a monkey looks in, no philosopher looks out." So, it feels like Bergson was just a canvas for so many people to project these different ideas onto.
Yeah,
And as we said, that could range from left-wing ideas to
yeah,
this is responsible for fascism and this is
yeah.
dangerous and anti-rational. There's an anecdote in the book, or there's a passage where you describe Bergson would say it took him 10 years to write his book, and he said that uh, I found this very important actually, because he said he'd only actually solved two philosophical problems he felt in his lifetime, um, which feels different to today. There's a pressure to have an opinion on everything constantly.
Mm,
And his seems like he had a sort of intellectual practice of intuition and patience, and you need to go in and deep, and this quick, fast-paced, algorithmic culture where we are both told to be incredibly specialist sometimes. I don't know, but as a performer,
yeah.
you have to niche, you have to find your niche, and you have to be a specialist, which is very mechanistic. At the same time, you then have to have an opinion and be exposed to all sorts of phenomena and concepts and stuff like that. Um, I wonder, what would Bergson say to all that today?
Yeah, he'd likely be horrified by a lot of the things that
Hmm.
um, the I think, yeah, you're right to underline that, because it's something I really liked about, when you study someone for a long time and you start reading their correspondence and stuff. This thing that keeps coming back with him, which he's really annoyed that because he's famous, people want his opinion on things, and so when journalists would come up to him, he would say, well, I haven't had time to think about that. Come back in 10 years and I'll give you my opinion then. As a way of saying, like, why the hell would you ask me about this? I'm thinking about memory. um, I think he would have a lot to say on, the idea that AI is creative, when he would probably say that it's an illusion of creativity, in the sense that creativity is not, you know taking bits and pieces of things that already exist and reassembling them in a different order. That's certainly not creativity. um, Creativity is about the confrontation between inspiration and material constraints, and it's unclear that so-called AI is able to offer that. He would have a lot to say about the kind of really insidious ways in which we're quantified without even realizing it. With the way in which algorithms or things like that are kind of categorizing every decision we make online, and then putting us in various boxes to either sell us things or push various ideologies at us. Um, that would, for him, be a very good example of the dangers of quantification, literal dangers, but also I would say it's dangerous as well, because it kind of then defines the way that we see ourselves. Um, and and I think there's just, the anxieties of people in the early 20th century about all of these things. I do think there's real parallels between the anxieties that we are all feeling now, of but perhaps even more so nowadays, or in a different flavor certainly, but
Mm.
of ways in which our humanity is being challenged at every turn, and we're losing spaces to be in touch with our humanity, and we're actively being encouraged to dehumanize ourselves through, and by that I mean to embrace the quantification of it all, and not take the time to, as you said, reflect and tap into our pure durée.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely note to end it on. And there's like many things I wanted to ask as well, but not going to have time for. But I recommend everyone just read the book. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
We touched a lot upon like Bergson's ideas, but maybe not so much of his life as well. So there's lots to check out. It's really good. Yes, thanks so much. Really nice conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. That's it for this week's episode. Big thanks to Emily Herring. I do recommend her book, Herald of a Restless World. I'll put some links to all of her work in the show notes. And thank you so much to everyone who's been listening, sharing the podcast, sending me nice messages. It's really good. And just to say, if you've been listening and you want to financially support us, that's very helpful. You can do so at patreon.com/The Bardo Podcast. There's also a link in the description. You can give £5 a month or whatever you like, and it really does help me continue making these. And if you did enjoy it, share it to everyone. Subscribe, leave reviews, it all helps. If you want to get in touch or see what's coming up, you can find me at marcsalmoncomedy.com. Try not to be too mechanical this week, and we'll see you next time in the in-between. Have a good one.